Hey there, I'm Mr. Terry, I'm a high school history teacher. Welcome back to another History Teacher Reacts video. All right, you guys, we're back to the channel Kraut, and his latest caught my attention. It's titled, Can Poland into Space? So I don't know exactly what's going to be covered here. Is it actually about Poland, or are they just playing on the country balls memes? Is it about space program? Is it about the Polish space program? I guess we'll find out. Our original video link is down below. Make sure you support that. Let's see what we're getting into today. Space. The final frontier. Poland
Going
ball.
to space is surprisingly more dependent on geography than you may first expect. The best way to go to space is by taking advantage of Earth's rotational speed, so you can save up some fuel. That means the best place to launch is close to the equator, where Earth's rotational speed is at its maximum.
You also have to do that if you're going to put something into an orbit. You have to try to match the orbital trajectory there. Otherwise, that thing's either going to fly off into space or because of gravity fall right back to Earth.
Since our planet rotates west to east, it's best to launch rockets into the east. And since things can go wrong during a launch and the rocket may fall out of the sky, or because rockets may have stages to drop, it would be ideal to have a lot of empty space east of where you're launching from.
That's why most stuff launches from the east coast of Florida, so it goes out to the ocean.
The geography of going to space begins on Earth, and the geopolitics of space will revolve around who controls the ability to launch into space.
Good. I love space
The Americans
history
launch
and
from Florida.
you know,
It is
all
close to
this.
the equator, and if something is dropped or goes wrong, it goes straight into the Atlantic. America has even more options available. For future space programs, Hawaii, or should they become states, Guam and Puerto Rico, would be even better launching sites than Florida. The United States is in the unique position of having multiple perfect places from which they could launch into space completely undisturbed.
Issue with that, I guess, the factories that make those missiles and all that stuff have different places all over the country, from literally coast to coast, California to Florida. They're different, you know, depending on the manufacturers, different parts of it. You know, look at something like Boeing, you know, and their products that they make, they're all over the country.
Adding to that is a society that has the resources to go to space. The Americans will therefore continue to be this
Gotta have a lot of extra money
in space and will probably dominate the space sector for decades to come.
All right, European Space
The
Agency.
Europeans are largely screwed in the geography of space. Not only are they distant from the equator, but anything they launch and would fail or drop would come down over Russia.
That's true.
Now, some of you may not care much about the well-being of Russia, but it also means that Russia could shoot down anything launched from Europe. Therefore, European rockets are launched from the French overseas territory of French Guiana in South America. If French Guiana
Is that what they do? Is that what the ESA does? Do they launch out of there? I hadn't thought about that because I hear about the space agency, but I never thought of where their launch sites would be. And I guess they don't team up with the U.S. to use, you know, Cape Canaveral or something like that.
Become independent in the future, European ambitions for an independent space program would be kind of screwed. Europe would then have to go ask others to launch their rockets for them, or build a completely new spaceport, for which the Portuguese islands, called the Azores, would be the best alternative location.
That makes
Europe
sense.
was late to developing space programs, and
Shipping
for
stuff's gonna
decades,
be harder,
each country
though.
pursued its own goals with limited resources. In 1975, the European Space Agency was founded, and by now Europeans learned that they have a better chance at going to space when they work together.
True.
If there is to be a European future in space, Europe will have to continue working together. Europe is largely still catching up to others, especially in launch capabilities, although they are real good in satellites and deep space research. And for the time being, Europe has hitched itself to working with NASA in the hope of learning from the
ESA does a lot of
Americans.
impressive stuff. Russians, yeah. They have a much better
When there's talk
setup.
of a coming space race, it is often framed in the old Cold War terms with the Americans and the Soviets. But
Okay. Do I want to read all this? I'll pause this right here. I don't think I'll go through all of it. I see a bunch of other swear words and other stuff in here, so maybe I'll have to check that out another time.
space race, it is often framed in the old Cold War terms with the Americans and the Soviets. But that is largely untrue. Russia is on a decline from space.
Ask you guys a question. Okay, I don't want you to think about this hard, okay? Who won the space race? Now think about it. Right? Think of all the milestones. Add them all up. First to put something into space. First to put animal, person, orbit, put something on the moon, fly to Mars, put a person on the moon, all those things. Add them all up. Who do you think won the space race? Let me know down below.
Russia was the pioneer in space. It sent the first satellites to space,
he's
the
good
first
to it.
human beings, and the first space stations. Russia used to sell rocket engines to the West because the Soviets were the first to figure
All the
out
early milestones.
propulsion for space travel, mainly through their genius chief rocket engineer Sergei Korolev. But when Korolev died in 1966, the Soviet space program stagnated and declined from here on, unable to produce such a genius and his innovations again. Rocket propulsion may have been a great innovation in the 1950s and 1960s, and while it is still a big deal, it isn't that much of a big deal today anymore. Billionaires can hire engineers to do it. In fact, you can watch Taiwanese nerds build rocket propulsion systems with 3D printers here on YouTube. Those may be small in scale, but who knows where those nerds will be in a few years.
It is really interesting, the privatization now of space travel, space flight and all that stuff. Of course, you got Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos that are very into it. Elon even making it really kind of sound like that was his goal in the first place with all of his business pursuits, going back to like PayPal and all, and these are things like it seems like directed at trying to get the funds necessary to build a space program. Like that was the end goal. And he's talked about how, his big goal is he wants humans to be an interplanetary species, right? With colonizing Mars. It's like he's directed all of this stuff in his life, building up as a business mogul into that. Bezos, I don't know. I don't know if he has much. Does he have like that kind of philosophy that Elon Musk does? I mean, he does Blue Origin and likes to shoot up into space and stuff like that. But does he have the big plans, you feel like, that because I haven't heard it yet. You can let me know as compared to Elon.
What will hurt Russian space ambitions the most is isolationism. The Russians ended partnerships with Europe and America, and an American, European, and East Asian ban on selling semiconductors and laser technology to Russia is destined to put its space program on a decline. Because,
by the way, semiconductors are everything when it comes to this stuff. Semiconductors are everything. Look into them if you don't know. Why?
Because as much as Taiwan right now cannot into space,
Taiwan's
when
a
Russia
huge producer.
tells her she can into China, Taiwan will remind Russia that Russia cannot into semiconductors. Bottom line
Geopolitics.
is, if you want to be a leader in space today, those who sell semiconductors are more important than those who sell rocket propulsion systems. Meaning, if you want to go to space, good relations to Taiwan and the Netherlands are more important than with Russia.
That stuff became so popular with semiconductors. And really got going, especially in the 80s. My dad worked for a semiconductor company that was actually working on semiconductors for the whole Star Wars project from the Reagan administration. If you'd heard about that, which never came to fruition, but did show that it was like something they were investing in, because literally like people like my dad were working on those semiconductors that were going to be designed for, again, this whole Star Wars things of putting stuff into space for like for national protection, basically space lasers and all that.
Russia still has one great thing going for them. The Baikonur spaceport is one of the best launch sites in the world. Something the Russians seem to have forgotten, though, is that it is in Kazakhstan. And after recently being proven unable to force their will onto other countries, Russia has
They don't control them
that
anymore.
the space program is dependent on Kazakh goodwill.
They're independent.
Space travel has changed dramatically since the Cold War. It is no longer just a matter of scientific and national prestige. Modern space travel is an intricate network of international cooperation between science institutes, public sector, private corporations, and market interests from multiple countries across the entire globe. Close to nobody goes to space alone anymore. Going to space today means working together with others. The Russians massively shot themselves in the foot. They will not be one of the main competitors in a future space race.
And even in the United States, where they may be able to do everything self-contained within the country, it will be a project that brings in the private and public spheres together. We've come to that point where NASA does not just work in a vacuum anymore. They outsource so many products. Funding for the space programs as a percentage of our GDP in the U.S. has dropped significantly, really since Apollo 11, when funding started to go down and down, and essentially when the Americans felt they won the space race and didn't feel like it was a part of national, not security, but like, I don't know, national pride, I guess you would say. So now the private sector has come in, and why it's booting up again is because of the private sector getting involved in it at those government contracts. All right, China. Yeah, China program.
China is one of the co-founders of the Asia-Pacific Space Cooperation Organization, founded in 2005. Unlike the Russians, the Chinese correctly understood the challenges of modern space travel, primarily that walking it alone is undesirable and that cooperation is desirable. The Chinese like to promote their space
who do they work
program as
with?
a fundamentally collaborative effort for the benefit of all of Asia, just under Chinese leadership. This is smart. The West may at some point put restrictions on the export of semiconductors and laser technology to China, but can it do the same for the rest?
And again, you can see the geopolitics coming in there because Taiwan, they're like, is it basically their biggest industry now is semiconductors, and the geopolitical situation between them and China definitely going to make things tough for China.
By formulating their space program as international in its mission, China has protected their ambitions in space, but also unintentionally damaged them. China's current priorities are to get a man on the moon and to expand its satellite navigation system Baidu as a competitor to the American GPS. But Iran, who is part of the organization, prioritizes military satellites and rockets that can come back down to Earth over Israel.
Different
which annoys
motivations.
China. Pakistan also pursues military goals
With
in
India,
its space program,
against India.
which would offer potential for cooperation with Iran. But Pakistan's rocket program targets Iran's friend India, which makes Iran unhappy, but China happy.
Also have a motivation with them, with Pakistan and India, as they're both nuclear powers too.
You see the problem? What's the point of having partners when you can't agree with them? The clearly implied Chinese leadership has also increasingly made partners like Thailand uneasy. China made an organization without clearly defining its goals, and for her neighbors, all it did was incentivize them to work harder on their own space programs. What one should also not forget is that China's space program is plagued with many failures, the most recent in 2021. Unable to develop things such as high-end semiconductors that Taiwan has, it has only been since 2019 that China subsidized the creation of private companies in the space industry and shared a few of its state-secret rocket technologies with those. Whether this will improve on the Chinese space program is yet to be seen.
Yeah, I mean, China wants to go in-house. It's interesting because it's been the Chinese economic policy forever, like literally forever. We're talking like millennia, has been one of self-sufficiency. I mean, seriously, go back to ancient times when they've always had the balance of being an exporter nation more than an import nation and trying to hold on to those cultural and economic stability there. It's just been ingrained self-sufficiency in Chinese culture literally forever. Probably going back from the River Valley civilization period where China developed pretty much independently of the other great Indian, like Indus Valley civilization and Mesopotamia and Egypt and all that. They're so geographically distant that they develop this culture like that. It's not out of nowhere. And it's not because they're, it's not a new thing because they, of their civil war and Communist Party takes over. It doesn't matter. We'll go back through dynastic China, through 3,000 years of dynastic history.
To India and Japan, China's Asia-Pacific Space Organization is primarily seen as one thing: a threat. Especially to India. From their perspective, this organization almost looks like a belt intended to surround her. Consequently, this Chinese initiative did more good for the Indian space program than it did for the Chinese space program, because India was motivated into gearing up its space program. There may have been some initial problems and some failures, but it is today very clear that
rocket
India
technology
is
for
catching up
nukes.
very fast with its Chinese rival. In fact, India recently became the 4th country to land on the moon. And just a quick look at the news coverage will show you the politics at play here. I can see on ground news that more than 300 sources from around the world reported on this story, and the coverage is pretty evenly distributed across the political spectrum. But if I scroll down, I can compare every single article on the topic with convenient tags showing me
Need to check out
context
this
about the
news
source, like how
program.
reliable it is and who owns it. This US-based source on the left suggests India is joining an elite club. But beyond
Sponsor
the
coming in.
left-right political spectrum,
Look at
what
all
I really like to see is the difference in how nations
Look at all
report on the
those.
same events. For example, this source, based out of New Delhi, emphasizes the fact that India is the first nation to land near the moon's south pole. And other than the South China Morning Post, which
Is that harder to do that? Is it just a way to like, wait, who was the source on that?
to land near the moon's south pole. And
Out of New Delhi. Okay, is he saying there's bias, a little bit of bias in there, or at least trying to make it sound better, like okay, obviously India is not the first country to put something on the moon. Multiple now have, but like, you know, is it an extra achievement to put it on the south side? So like trying to display it as, again, adding as much accomplishment to it as you can.
And other than the South China Morning Post, which is based out of Hong Kong, there are no major Chinese news sources reporting on this development. Sometimes not saying anything says a lot.
That one was successful, right? The India one, like it's successful as far as it completed all its stuff. Which was the one that crashed? Was it Israel? The one that crashed, it was, you know, it'd be a big thing, and then it didn't land safely. Was that one, or was that China? I want to say it was the Israel one. A couple years ago, I think.
Ground News has been a reliable companion in my research endeavors for videos like this. It ensures that I stay updated on
I want to say it was the Israel
topics, thanks to the worldwide selection of sources. Their mission aligns with much of what I do here, diving deeply into issues, providing
and was
context.
Was it the China one that they went to like the dark side of the moon, as it's called? Wasn't that their thing? That they were one of the first to do that? I don't know if the American missions, any of the craft landings went on that side of the moon. I'm trying to remember this stuff, but yeah, China's was supposed to be like that.
Informed discussions. It's especially useful right now as the world grapples with the events in Israel and Palestine.
Okay, if you want to take advantage of his deal, go to the original video for sure for ground. But the service kind of seems interesting. Being able to see, like, because, you know, it looks like they will try to label sites, or sorry, news articles, and then organize them by historical, like, biases or perspectives. You know what I mean? So
India is also already blessed by something China lacks: the perfect geography for going to space. India's spaceports are all in the south, as close to the equator as possible, and charged into space over the Indian Ocean. India also has something else: an education sector built on initiative and innovation and transparency and creativity.
Very good education system
mandated drill emphasis of China. And India can also rely on an innovative private sector and the large pool of highly educated Indian
capitalistic
expats,
country,
giving India the educational edge. India is about to send a
democratic government
in 2024. Its space program shows enormous promise. Japan also was pushed into greater action by China, but Japan focuses on civilian sectors: navigation, environmental protection, surveillance, and communication.
Plus, a lot of this technology is often combined into like military and militarism. Having those technologies be able to be beneficial for both. Remember, the Japan is still very limited in what their military capabilities can be since World War II and the agreements that the United States put onto Japan, basically limiting their size of their military, not letting them basically get involved offensively in things like that. And there's, things here and there that maybe have been exceptions to that, but those things still play out today, of those of Japan from World War II that the Americans still kind of impose and oversee directly here many years later.
It is astonishing how little we hear in the West of the Japanese space program in our news, because it is very impressive. The Japanese just happen to be very humble about it. In existence since the 1950s, even though they never sent a man into space, Japan was never far behind the United States when it comes to satellite and rocket technology. Japan has a geographically great spaceport in Tanegashima, and Japan has conducted many
military threat
launches. And besides a great geography for space, Japan also owns two other things needed for space: a lot of money and a lot of very big brains. Popular news media likes to sometimes raise the specter of a looming space race between China and the United States, which is really not the case. It is more appropriate to speak of an Asian space race, where the threat of China has pushed India and Japan to work together, and the rest of Asia will be picking sides between those two teams.
Yeah. Well, so you can see, again, going back, I think you can, every single space program, if you look at it, all the space programs in countries that have been there have all had a military motivation to develop these technologies. So like Israel, okay, with their geopolitical situation, with enemies around them, and also having access to nuclear technology. The India and Pakistan are going to be involved in that because of their political problems, going back to the partition of India in 1947 and the military problems that come with that. Because again, rocket technology, the same rocket technology that can be used to put stuff into space could also be used as a weapon. So there's a dual motivation there. But then you have Japan, for example, and after World War II, it's not like the Americans are going to they were not going to allow them to have a technology for, putting stuff into space that could also be used for potential military conflict, right, in the wake of World War II. So China always going to have something going on with interest in their military ambitions or whatever, and pretty much anybody in Europe too. So you can see the history tied to all this as well. He's talking a lot about geography, but yeah, like history is going to be super important to understand space technologies for all these countries. Blessed by geography, yeah. And I haven't looked at the geography part as much as he has. I'm glad he's been talking about this. This has been enlightening for me.
Big in space travel who have the best geography for space travel. It's Brazil, Venezuela, Ghana, Nigeria, Cameroon, Kenya, Somalia,
they're not going to be able to do it.
India, Sri Lanka, Philippines, Indonesia, Papua New Guinea, and Australia. These countries have the ideal geographies for getting to space, but they also prove that geography is not everything. Sure. Venezuela has the geography for space, but it has neither the money or functioning institutions for space.
You gotta have a motivation for all this stuff. You don't just do space stuff because you can. It's because you have, again, the money, and you have a motivation. What are you going to get out of it? Because it's insanely expensive and may not always have the benefits, to investment, turn on your investment. You know what I mean?
Venezuelan satellites are built and launched from China. Somalia has far more pressing issues, and so does Sri Lanka. Yeah. Kenya has the best geography for launching into space in the world. But rather than developing its own space program, they wish to sell launching sites to others. Africans know that throughout their history, whenever non-Africans wanted what Africans had, they came to take it by force. African ambitions are set on taking advantage of their own opportunities before anyone else can, but African states have a lot more challenges to settle on Earth before space is reachable as a frontier. So it is worth keeping in mind that African countries could also be set to lose. Australia, Indonesia, and the Philippines largely neglected their beneficial space geography. The Philippines relied on the Chinese to launch satellites, the Indonesians and Australians on the Americans. But in recent years, with more interest in space, all of them are now more intensely exploring the ideas of their own space programs. If they lease their geography out, build their own programs, or continue to neglect it is yet to be seen.
On all those not hasn't been very long since they were colonies too, so there's still that colonial relationship, right? British and Australia, and then United States and the Philippines, Indonesia, I guess, with the Dutch, but maybe not as much, tying to their colonial history for their current space program, but they have those relationships already.
One thing to watch with all of them is with who they choose to work together in going to space. Yeah. The only countries who have a great geography for space and take full advantage of it are the aforementioned India and
Brazil could be very well set up for this, actually. Yeah,
Brazil has an unfortunate
money, geography,
political scientists,
a tech sector,
forever next superpower that for 200 years is just a few years away from being South America's superpower. Yeah. Brazil, like India, not only has the perfect geography for going to space, but also has a pretty decent space program. Yeah,
Brazilians, back up on this. I've been hearing that the tech sector, especially for Brazil, is exploding right now. Tech investment is going on there. So anyone involved in that, or my Brazilians at? Let me know.
Brazil managed to develop this space program despite the Americans opposing it. The Americans blockaded the sale of rocket technology to Brazil since the 1980s, when Brazil managed to make its space program increasingly independent from the United States. In return, Brazil worked increasingly with China on developing her space program.
The US doesn't want anyone to do it without their
began seeing
blessing
as one of its main competitors, mainly because Brazil's launch site was geographically better and cheaper. The Americans also worried that if American companies began sending rockets to be launched from Brazil, the Brazilians would steal American technology and sell it.
They wouldn't need to, though.
Americans were banned from launching rockets in Brazil. But despite these American
measures, the
Brazilian space program persevered. The American boycott of the Brazilian space program eventually ended in 2019. But before you cheer for the plucky yet successful Brazilian space program, you should know that it also has its own dark history. The launch site was built on quilombolas. The quilombolas are runaway African slaves who fled the Brazilian slave plantations into the isolated regions of northern Brazil, where far away from the plantations and their owners, they built farms and constructed communities. In 1982, the Brazilian military dictatorship bulldozed the quilombola farms of Alcantara and chased away the 300 Afro-Brazilian farmers and fishermen who lived there to build the Brazilian Space Launching Center. This is a really well-hidden historical fact. You will not find it on the Wikipedia page.
I haven't heard of this.
Space Center, and the only reason I know this is because at university my professor for Latin American history gave it as an example when teaching us about the legacies of slavery in Brazil. And this very down-to-earth social issue lies at the core of what may
Shout out to the teachers.
the Brazil space program in the future. In 2019, Bolsonaro agreed to expanding the Space Center, but that expansion plan would have meant taking the land of up to 1,000
Still going,
Quilombola
the current
families
presidency?
and destroying 600 Quilombola villages.
Wow.
Northern Brazil is an ideal location for going to space. With the American boycott gone, private companies and governments are lining up to do launches. Brazil could become the South American center for space travel. Northern Brazil has historically been the poorest part of Brazil and still continues to be. The majority of the northern population is Afro-Brazilian, and is also where you will find the Quilombolas, so having this infrastructure there would benefit the region. But obviously, just bulldozing towns into the ground and chasing away their peoples is something that a democratic and free Brazil should not do. So before Brazil can proceed further into space, it will probably have to enter negotiations with locals over recompensation to expand their space center to not repeat the mistakes of the 1980s.
My question would be, Brazilians, help me out with this. He's saying how they're going to have to they're going to need to negotiate with those, indigenous peoples and the population up north. But do you think if they can't make an agreement that Brazil would then not do it, or do you think they would just do it anyways and force it? What do you think there, Brazilians? Let me know.
At the end of this video, I want to shout out Ravignon. He is a YouTuber who's been featured on this channel before. You might recognize his work in the thumbnail of the Neutrality in Europe after 2022 video, or collab on how Christianity destroyed the tribal family, and some other slides on this channel, including within this video. Ravignon is working on a long-format Poland Ball documentary series on the history of Quebec, and that series just released its third part.
If I should follow this stuff,
long look at a society
to reach out to this guy.
With my series on Turkey and Mexico, then you'll love to watch Ravignon's project on Quebec. I'll leave a link in the description below to the third episode, and I hope you can support his channel as well.
All right, guys, final thoughts. All right, great. I love dabbling into space-related topics. It's one of my other things outside of history that I really love. I love astronomy, space stuff. In fact, if I wasn't teaching history, and if I was still going to be a teacher, I'd love to teach astronomy. I think that would be like my next thing to do that. And it's fun when it can all come together, when we could talk about history and space and stuff like that. So good job. I learned a ton here from Kraut on this one about these programs. I hadn't appreciated the geographic aspect of this enough, and now I think I've come away with that. Hopefully I was able to add the historical context, because that wasn't really talked about as much here. So hopefully you can see the geopolitics, the economics, and the history all come together and talking about the past, current, and future state of the space programs there. So, all right, with that, y'all, thanks for hanging out today. Again, original videos down below, so support that, and we'll see y'all next time. Bye.